Fortunately, there are no exams at the end of this session.
No.
But as you might imagine, somebody who lives their life that way probably isn't very provident in providing for the future.
Life's Third Act is a podcast dedicated to helping you get the most out of your retirement. Sponsored by Tucker Allen. Here's attorney CPA Joe Cordell.
Welcome to another episode of Life's Third Act. This week we're going to talk about somebody who, from the early film era, who nonetheless continued to act into the modern era, into the 21st century. Again, this is an opportunity for us to learn about how one plans one's life as well as one's death and estate, and the extent to which some people do a bad job and others do a good job. We focus on celebrities, but we find that not only are they more interesting than most people, they often provide more mistakes for us to look at and figure out how we might have done things differently. And this person this week, while not the early screen actor that readily comes to mind for some people, nonetheless was very big in his day. Those of you who are under 50 probably have to kind of take my word for it, though you've probably seen some of the movies he was in. But still, those over 50, you know this name. No more suspense. Marley, who are we going to talk about today?
Yeah, today we're going to talk about Mickey Rooney. Just like you introduced him, he is a legendary film actor. He had a 9-decade-long career, appeared in over 300 films, and I personally remember him from Breakfast at Tiffany's and Night of the Museum. Because
I had to think about Breakfast at Tiffany's.
Yeah, that role was kind of controversial, so I think that's why it's not like as well known. Maybe
for those of you who are wondering, he played the Japanese neighbor that lived upstairs. Is that right?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's correct.
It was a stereotyping is the reason it's controversial.
Yes. Yeah. I think it's definitely become more controversial over the years, not when the movie first appeared. But he was just very well known. He had a huge career in musicals, acting, film, comedy, TV, all kinds of things. Just alone from like the age of 15 to 25, he had over 43 films, which is just absolutely crazy. And it was kind of wild digging into just like himself, because, most of the time on like a lot of our resources, it will introduce like the person, and then it'll go through all of their childhood and kind of like what set them up to be an actor or an actress or, a singer or whatever may have you. But his was really interesting because he didn't have much of that like childhood introduction, because like at 17 months old, he was already in his first like show with his parents, and he started acting when he was 6. And so it was kind of just like shoved right into his just career, basically. He didn't have much of a childhood outside of that. So I found that super interesting.
Yeah, his parents were in Vaudeville, and his mother, actually after the divorce, when I guess Mickey Rooney was 5, he had already been on the stage a few times in the skits or performances of the mom and dad. But mom had the foresight or whatever to go from New York to move to California. And apparently she did this in mind, not for her own career, but believing that her son had a career. So I guess at age 5, she saw potential, and she must have been right. He almost immediately started getting parts.
Yeah. She pushed really hard for him too. She herself used to be in burlesque, and then she joined the vaudeville show whenever she married her husband. So Mickey Rooney was actually born Joseph Yule Jr. in 1920. So Mickey Rooney is not his real name. I don't know how many people know that, but they're probably aware of that. But like I said, he started acting on stage or performing on stage at a really young age, at 17 months old, and that was in his parents' show. And then from there, his mom just really encouraged him. Whenever they moved to Hollywood, he debuted as like an actor for the very first time in a silent film called Not to Be Trusted. He was only 6, which I found really interesting, that he was playing kind of like an adult role as a 6-year-old kid. But like they had him like smoking cigars, and like he was playing like a con man. And I think everybody just from that silent film, even though he didn't have like any lines or anything, they saw like who he was going to be as an actor and how hard he was going to work. And so his mom just like really pushed for it. And then she found the role of Mickey McGuire, and the role actually called for a brunette child to come out and audition. And obviously Mickey Rooney, when he was born, he was blonde. So she was like, no, I know you're going to be great for this role. So she dyed his hair brunette and sent him in to audition for that role, and he got it. And that's kind of where his name Mickey Rooney actually stemmed from, because he fell in love with the character so much that he really wanted to like take a part of him with him. And he was like, I can't steal the entire name, but I'll steal the first name, Mickey. And then they actually had some family friends who their last name was Rooney. And they were like, yeah, you can, of course, use our last name. And so he kind of thought that fit really well together.
Yeah, apparently for a while he did try using the Mickey McGuire name. And, of course, I'm sure some copyright interest or objection was raised. But this role, again, those of you who are under 50 or so, maybe under 60 or more, may not remember the Mickey McGuire comic series, but there was, and it was very popular. So for him to be in a series of movies through this was very fortunate for his career. So we have a guy who, again, keep in mind, we'll go to the end, he's acting up until virtually his death in 2014. So he's in silent films. So when he's referred to in our research material as among the very last living people who were stars in silent film, I'm sure he wasn't the only one, but several sources referred to him as one of the few that were still living in 2014 and acting. I bet he owned that exclusively. But But anyway, he had a very long career. So he does the Mickey McGuire series, does that for a number of years, and then there's something new that emerges.
Yeah, and then in 1934, he actually signs with MGM Studios. They kind of found him and they loved him, and that's when he went on to play in one of his biggest roles as Puck in A Midsummer's Night's Dream, which was just really the role that like took him forward. But then right after that, he got another big break when he got cast as Andy Hardy in the film A Family Affair, and MGM realized like how much everybody loved that film, and then they started a series. Yes. The character, how much everybody loved the Andy Hardy character. And then they started a series of movies with the Andy Hardy character. And that character kind of just showcased what like an American boy should be, and people just really like fell in love with that character. But it was really funny because outside of that, Mickey Rooney, and this will kind of come into the play throughout his adult life, he didn't act like Andy Hardy. He kind of like ran the show, and he definitely had a big attitude, knew he was a famous child star, and ran with that. And so MGM, throughout the years of just Andy Hardy, they kind of had some pushback and from him about being like, outside of the role, we want you to actually act like him. And he was like, no, I don't want to do that. And like I said, this kind of just travels on throughout his life, where he didn't really want to conform, and he didn't always want to be like the best person ever, because he was like, no, I'm a great actor. That's all I like should have to be.
Yeah, he had a run there where he did, 43 films?
43 films, yep.
So that was from what year, 34 through 45?
Yeah, his biggest years were 1939 to 1941, with like Andy Hardy and everything like that.
Yeah, and so up until the end of World War II, he had this run with MGM, and was very successful. The things they did with Judy Garland, many people remember those movies best. But he also was in Black Beauty. Was it Black Beauty?
Yes. So farther on down, Black Stallion. Sorry, the Black Stallion. Okay. Later in his career, it was in like 1979, I believe, is when that movie came out. He played like a supporting role in that. But that was kind of after like he went to the war and everything, which we can talk about as well.
So what were the Judy Garland movies? Didn't he do 3 or so?
Yeah. So Judy Garland and him, they actually started out in several musicals. It was Babes in Arms was one of their biggest, and that was 19 1939. And then they became friends, like you said, and they started doing movies together. Boys Town, National Velvet.
National Velvet.
Some of like the bigger ones. And then another like bigger musicals were Strike Up the Band and Babes on Broadway.
Yeah. So anyway, so he's had this great run and with MGM. Yes. And before we talk about his marriages, so after he left MGM, he never had a long-term gig with a particular studio, did he? He did a series of he regularly acted, either on stage or in movies. Mm-hmm. So over his lifetime, he had how many? He was in 300 films or so?
Yeah, over 300 films.
So he regularly acted, but his fame was really best established by 1945. And anybody in America, he was one of the top actors in America in terms of name recognition, box office appeal. Now we're talking in the 30s and the early 40s. I mean, when you're in movies with Judy Garland and these movies that you named, Marley, those were all very big movies. This was a very recognizable name. And he was also drafted, wasn't he?
Yes, he was. So for World War II, he was drafted, but he was drafted to a special unit, which was like the entertainment unit. He actually earned a Bronze Star, though, because this unit would go out into like live combat zones and they would, entertain the troops and do just kind of all sorts of acts for them. And he loved it. He did that for about 2 years until he came home. And we'll kind of, like you said, we'll talk about this, but he is married during this time. He has a lot of marriages, but he comes back home and he is at the age where he's too old for like juvenile spots, like acting spots, but he's too short to play, unfortunately, like a grown adult, because he's only 5'2".
But it's funny though how I could see how that would normally be an impediment to one's career. Mm-hmm. But yet, I look at Danny DeVito and he plays just regular characters, not a what's the word? A character actor, meaning somebody who plays odd roles that relate to their particular height or their particular look. Those people are kind of doomed to that sort of thing. And I can see how a man who's 5'2" might potentially have far fewer roles, but then I look at Danny DeVito. Justin, find out how tall Dan DeVito was.
He is 4'10".
No. Is that right?
I think that's right.
What the internet says.
Then, okay, so we have an era when men were a lot shorter. So I really don't get this. But you're right. I always thought of him as being a short guy, and they would tend to put him in these kind of oddball roles. They didn't let him play normal roles. Like you gave an example earlier, this Japanese guy, this character that was very stereotyped. And that's kind of the issue with people's complaints of that role today. But the point is, he's a character actor, and I don't understand, given his ability to act, why the industry didn't permit, or perhaps he didn't succeed in his own efforts to be like a Danny DeVito. Think of all the roles Danny DeVito has. You even see him in roles where the fact that he's short has nothing to do with anything. I mean, he's just a guy.
Yeah, he's just a character in the movie, which I was thinking the same thing, because I was like, this is odd. Like, we've had, like shorter men and obviously like shorter women play roles that nobody would just like bat an eye at because they're like 4'10", 5'2", anything like that. But they really characterized him by his height, unfortunately. And I think he did do a very good job of like breaking out of that box and like taking his name back and getting those like bigger spots again later in his career.
Yeah, and it turned out that he could do some very serious dramatic acting, and he won a number of nominations for Academy Award. And didn't he win an Academy Award at one point?
Yeah, so he won Best Supporting Actor for The Black Stallion. He won. Well, no, he was nominated for a couple other Academy Awards, though. But he did earn a Best Actor Oscar for Babes in Arms, I believe.
Okay. So
yeah,
he was talented. He was a very talented actor, and I think he potentially got categorized, and maybe to the extent he did, in fact, get categorized from his roles playing kids because he was short, and they kind of put him in that role, continued him in that role into his 20s, where he's playing a young, say a kid and a teenager, for example, and it was difficult for him to, given his appearance, to start playing roles of adult guys and not calling attention in any way to the fact that, he's shorter than most guys.
Yeah, I agree. I think that really, like you said, the childhood actors very much like characterized his career. And I think once he came back from the war, especially, he knew that. So he was like, no, I don't want to do that. I don't want that to just be the end of my career and that to be my name. But I mean, even from the way that like people spoke about him, they were like, wow, this is like one of the best actors we've seen in a long time. Like, he's definitely one of the best. And I was reading something, this just goes to show like how good of an actor he was. I was reading something about he was doing one of his like shows later on in his career, and he went out to warm up the crowd because it was a live audience, and he was just doing, normal stuff of like just telling jokes and having them like ask questions, and somebody yelled out like Midsummer's Night's Dream. And at this point, I think he was like 40, 50. I can't remember exactly what year or age this was, but remember, he did Midsummer's Night's Dream when he was 14, and he looks down at the floor for a minute, and then he looks back up, and he just starts quoting the entire like end line of that movie that Puck had, and everybody was just silent for about like 4 minutes until he finished, and then they just like burst into applause. And that just goes to show, I mean, remembering those lines from years later just goes to show how good of an actor he is.
Yeah, and we should also add here that he had a great work ethic, and he did continue working virtually up until the point he died. He continued working, and fortunately had the health pretty much to do that. I mean, he deteriorated as anybody would at those ages as he hits his 90s, but still he worked. He had gigs and jobs almost to the very end. So let's talk about his marriages. That's definitely relevant to estate planning and life planning that we want to focus a little bit on.
Yeah, definitely. So I'll kind of go down a list. I do have it in front of me, so I apologize for reading off of it to our audience, but he's got a lot of wives, so I had to kind of put this all down. But his first wife was Ava Gardner, and they were married from 1942 to 1943. They had no children. A few things that I read about Ava Gardner is they went on the first date, and after their first date, he asked her to marry him. And they were around, like, I believe 19 and 21 at this age. And she, of course, just kind of laughed him off. But I guess every single day after that, he asked her to marry him. And about 5 months afterwards, she finally did. And they were married she finally accepted, and they were married 3 weeks after. So I think, just young love, stuff like that, kind of tore that marriage apart, unfortunately. But then he went on to marry Betty Jane Baker, and that was from 1944 to 1949. She's the mother of 2 children, Mickey Rooney Jr. and Tim Rooney.
And those are his kids.
Yes.
So they married, people should note, they married the same year that Ava Gardner and he divorced. So Go ahead.
Yeah, and then he marries, after that, Martha Vickers, and he marries her in 1949. So kind of the same thing as his first wife. They're married the same year as the divorce, and they split up in 1951. And she is the mother of Teddy Rooney, another one of his children. And then he goes on after this, and he dates Elaine Davis, and then he marries her in 1952 until 1958, and they don't have any children together. And then he meets Barbara Ann Tomlinson, that same year as the divorce again, and marries her in 1958 until 1966. She's the mother of Kelly Ann, Carrie, Michael Joseph, and Kimmy Sue Rooney. And so he was actually married to her for a while, and she cheated on him. He probably had his own part in this, but she cheated on him with an actor that he introduced her to. He was an Italian actor that Mickey Rooney had acted with in a movie overseas, and he had brought him back to their home and introduced him. And then they started the affair. Mickey found out, and Barbara was like, I want to split up. I want to go ahead and get a divorce. And Mickey didn't want that. He wanted to reconcile. So it kind of comes down to a point that Mickey's moved out of their house. Barbara goes to meet him at the hotel to serve him the divorce papers, but they end up reconciling there. And then Barbara goes back home, tells the man she was having an affair with, and then later that night, that man actually murdered her and then killed himself too. So that one ended pretty tragically, unfortunately. And I don't know if he would have ended up staying with her or not. I can't really, speak on that had that not happened. But from there, he meets Marge Lane. He does marry her in 1966, which is that same year that Barbara died. And then he divorces her in 1967, but the marriage only lasted 100 days. They didn't have any children or anything like that. And then he meets Carolyn Hockett in 1969 and marries her. And then they're married from 69 to 1975. And she has two more of his children, Jimmy and Janelle. And then he meets Jan Chamberlain, who is his very last wife. And that is in around, I believe he met her in 1977. They marry in 1978 and are married all the way up until 2014, but they did actually separate in 2012 and were going through a divorce process. They didn't have any children together, but we'll kind of talk about this later. Mickey did have a stepson named Christopher Aber, who was Jan's child. And Jan was his longest marriage of 34 years. But all in all, that's them. He did have 10 kids, and he was sometimes a good father, sometimes not.
Well, and I think that is 8 biological and 2 adoptive. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
So, fortunately, there are no exams at the end of this session.
No.
But as you might imagine, somebody who lives their life that way probably isn't very thoughtful or very provident in providing for the future. So
No.
I think that this pattern that you see here allows you to predict pretty well where he ends up. So Mickey Rooney, when he comes to the time of his death, which was 14, he's pretty much broke. And he's broke in part, though not entirely, but in part by the fact that he was a victim of fraud by this stepson that you referred to, who actually had control of his finances, not by court order, but apparently by Mickey Rooney's indifference or trust or inattentiveness, whatever it is. It went on for like 11 years, from around 2000 to 2011, and that's when apparently it was discovered that money was missing, and there was legal action taken. There was a judgment entered into. Perhaps I think it was a voluntary judgment, which usually you only have voluntary confessions of a judgment if in fact the charges have some merit. In any case, so this stepson ends up agreeing, he and his wife, to repay, I think it was $2.9 million.
Yeah, around 2.8 to 2.9 million, I believe.
But the allegation had been that they had actually squandered $8 million. That was what the lawsuit alleged. We don't know the exact numbers, but clearly it was a significant amount of money. But my thought is still that, yes, that was a big mistake, but on the part of Mickey Rooney, but it also reflects the fact that there wasn't that much money given somebody who had earned over a lifetime and had been pretty much regularly at work, meaning, he had a good work ethic, he wasn't lazy, and certainly he didn't command the highest incomes that actors could get, but we all know that somebody of his fame and the projects that he participated in, he should have had some of that money. But sadly, there wasn't that much to begin with. And usually if the lawsuit alleges 8, maybe there was, 6 or 5, or we don't know. It's probably not quite 8 if that was the allegation. So it's a shame that this money was wasted, but I think that part of the explanation for that may be in part the same explanation for why Mickey Rooney ends up in a position where he doesn't have that much money at that stage of his life. And what little money he has, he's trusting somebody that he shouldn't have been trusting. And he certainly should have asked for records along the way, which he apparently didn't do. There were allegations of elder abuse. I'm not suggesting that Rooney was not in some ways a victim. He was, but he wasn't entirely a victim, is my point. He handed over the keys to whatever wealth he had early on. I'm sure there was some deception involved. So I want to give Mickey Rooney the benefit of the doubt that there was some deception that went on that he, in fairness, wouldn't have known about. But at the end of the day, I still think that there was just a lot of inattentiveness on the part of Mickey during the period when he could have been more attentive during that first 5 to 6 years when this was going on.
Yeah, and he didn't really lose, his mental health was good. He didn't have Alzheimer's or anything like that I read of. But I do agree. I definitely do think that he was a victim of elder abuse. But I do think that there was more probably in the beginning that he didn't pay attention to that he should have.
So we're going to break here because we're breaking this into 2 shows. So just go to the next show to see this conversation continue. Another episode of Life's Third Act.
You've been listening to Life's Third Act, a podcast for thriving in retirement, sponsored by Tucker Allen, your estate and elder law advisors. Each week, we discuss topics and answer questions to help you better plan for your future. For more information, visit tuckerallen.com. Subscribe and listen again next week for another edition of Life's Third Act. The choice of a lawyer is an important decision and should not be based solely on advertisements.